there are massive protests happening right now in the South. I can pull up just a Xinhua article, which is Chinese media, and there's photos here of the protests, and they surround these military drills that are happening. Could you speak to what's going on? I think this is quite a frequent occurrence, maybe an annual occurrence. Can you talk about what's going on here? What are people protesting? And any background you can provide on this.
Yes, of course. Those are great photos, those protest photos you just
Sorry,
showed.
let me put them up.
I love them. Yes, and I think what's striking about these protests, as far as what I've seen so far, is that there's very little, if any, coverage of them in English language media. And there are tens of thousands of Korean people out protesting these military exercises, demanding the end of the US-South Korean alliance and future tensions between North and South Korea. So these protests, those photos are amazing. So many people out there demanding that US troops withdraw from Korea and demanding peace on the Korean Peninsula. So what are they protesting? We're about to enter military exercises that are colloquially called war games. The US and South Korea in a few days will begin joint land, air, and sea exercises that will basically stimulate and practice an invasion of North Korea and war against North Korea. It's basically like a dress rehearsal for a war. This year's exercises are going to be the largest in a number of years. They've been put on pause in person for a few years, since 2018, and since then they've been doing computer simulations of the exercises, but this is the first, and I believe 5 years that they'll be in person. And tens of thousands of people are taking to the streets in Korea to demand the end of these military exercises. They increase tensions between North and South Korea. They are truly rehearsals of war. And another thing that's striking about the fact of them being rehearsals is that North Korea can't necessarily know whether or not they will be actual practice rehearsals or whether they might be a guise for an actual intervention or an actual invasion. So not only do they escalate tensions, it's very possible that they would include an actual invasion or an actual act of warfare. So that's sort of a little bit of context about what exactly is going on, what the military exercises are, and why people are protesting them.
Yeah, no, and those photos, I mean, it seems massive. I know that there were also protests. This has kind of been a summer-long thing, maybe for different reasons. But I also remember there were, I know that the trade unions are very involved in these kind of protests. And I know that if you could explain, there was also protests about the economic situation not too long ago. So it feels like there's kind of a bleed in. I don't know if that's true or not, but could you speak about that?
Yes, I think you're right that the sort of base of people invested in or demanding the end of these military exercises, the end of US occupation of Korea is very broad, and it does include partners from trade unions and labor organizers. The KCTU trade union was also a part of this recent protest that we just saw the photos of too, so that's exactly right.
Right. So if you could talk about this, because this doesn't get covered. You said that the North Korea, DPRK, doesn't actually know whether these military exercises are just a prelude to sparking off or breaking the quote unquote armistice that's been signed, or whether there's actually going to be a war. Can you talk about why that is? Because this is what always gets me about when Korea is talked about, when the DPRK is getting slandered in the media. We, in the Western mainstream media at least, we often are told that the DPRK is belligerent, that it's the belligerent one, it's the one that's nuking up, it's the one that's shooting ballistic missiles, but not a lot about how dangerous these military exercises are. Could you talk about why should the DPRK feel threatened? What is the US's footprint? Why is this so significant? Are these just small, like little games? They're just shooting rubber bullets, or is there something more going on here?
Yes, that's a great question. And you're exactly right that what we hear about North Korea is that North Korea is the aggressor and that the US is simply being defensive. The Biden administration has called these military exercises defensive, quote unquote. But what's actually happening is that there are actual military drills happening on land, in the air, in the sea, that are practices of what troops should do if we were to invade North Korea. In fact, there are even rehearsals so outlandish where they practice decapitating North Korean leaders. So basically a rehearsal of assassinating North Korean leaders after invading and instigating a war. That is totally crazy. They are literally practicing what it would look like to decapitate and assassinate the North Korean people. And I think language is kind of a big theme around these military exercises. The US calls them defensive and calls North Korea the aggressor, when actually the US has 30,000 troops stationed in Korea, ready and willing to begin war at any time. And moreover, these military exercises are often called war games. I think that's pretty significant and worth sitting with too. To call something a game when what's at stake here is the actual lives of tens of thousands of Korean people. If any of these exercises were to be a guise for an actual invasion or an actual attack, then the people who would suffer are the people who are out there protesting, demanding that the US leave Korea. Thousands of people would die, cities would be totally destroyed, and the US is calling these games. What does that say about how the United States sees the livelihoods or the sanctity of life of the Korean people?
Mm. Yeah, exactly. And I definitely want to get into if you could, but before this though, I want to show something, but I definitely to follow up on this. You spoke a little bit about what the threat is, but there's also a history to this, and I know that there have been celebrations, right, for Korea's liberation from Japan. But what came after that was I think, quite an example of why the DPRK would feel threatened. What happened during the U.S. invasion of Korea. But I want to first show Abby Martin. She is coming out with a documentary about her participation. She was able to go to the RIMPAC exercises, so different, not on the Korean Peninsula, but these exercises occurred off the coast of California and Hawaii. But there's something very interesting about them that she put out a clip about this. And so I just want to, it kind of gets into what you're talking about, Janice, literally practicing exactly what you're saying, which is
Oh, yes, I did.
a literal exercise, practicing an invasion. This is definitely an invasion of the DPRK, and I'll show you why.
Mm-hmm.
So there you have it. That's just a short clip from the film showing exactly what you said, James. Do you have any reactions to that?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you showed that. I saw that recently and I was just so struck and upset by seeing it. I think also the US has claimed that these specific types of exercises are not intended to be specific to any country, I believe. And that's the whole reason that this video is so alarming, is that obviously it is very specific to a specific country, and they know what they're doing and they know who they're intending to attack. I think what's also striking about this year's military exercises in particular is that South Korea also has a new presidential administration. And the Biden administration has sort of been building up its military alliance with the new South Korean president, whose name is Yoon Suk-yeol. And in May, they had a summit where President Biden vowed that Washington would, quote, deploy strategic US military assets in a timely and coordinated manner as necessary. Sort of demonstrating a willingness to deploy nuclear weapons is the subtext, I think, of that quote. And the new Yoon administration, South Korea, is very conservative and very intent on escalating military tensions with the North. So I think these exercises are sort of a public demonstration of the South Korean military and the American military rebuilding their alliance, demonstrating to the public we are ready and willing to start a war at any moment, and showing that to the world and saying that not only is it that the Korean War hasn't ended, and I'd love to talk about that a little bit more too, as you mentioned earlier, but it's also that because the war hasn't ended, we are constantly on the brink of war. And I think there's something there about how it's not just that war is constantly background noise, or that it's kind of this underlying presence, which it is, but it's also that consistently and constantly there are new tensions being escalated, there are new drills, there are new rehearsals. We're constantly on the brink of war. War could truly happen at any minute. And that's because the US has shown a great willingness to collaborate with currently a very conservative South Korean government to escalate tensions at any given moment.